Hello and welcome to The Economist's last subscriber event of 2023. I'm Rachna Shanbhogue, The Economist's Business Affairs Editor, and today I'm joined by our Editor-in-Chief, Zanny Minton-Beddoes, and Deputy Editor, Edward Carr, to take a look back at the biggest stories of the year. Now, let's begin, Zanny and Ed, with one of the biggest stories that has dominated the news in the second half of this year, Hamas's brutal attacks on October 7th and Israel's subsequent invasion of Gaza. And Ed, you were in Israel recently. You've written many of our leaders on this topic. It's an incredibly difficult subject, but recently you've written about the possibility of peace coming out of this awful situation. Could that really be possible, and what needs to happen?
Well, thank you, Rachna, and good afternoon, everybody. I guess I start from this from the point that the leaders are about the world as we'd like it to be, not as the world as it is. And if you look at the suffering, the terrible suffering in the Holy Land at the moment, it not only fills you with sorrow, it actually fills me with anger. I feel that something's got to change here. This just can't go on for year after year and decade after decade. And that's why I think you need peace. Sometimes when people talk about a peace process and two states, they do it as a rather hollow promise to be able to sort of change the subject. I think people take a second look and they think, God, how hard is this going to be? You've got to deal with the settlers. You've got to deal with the incredible level of anger and hatred in the region on both sides. And they think, peace is hopeless. But then I think you take a third look, and it's that third look that interests me and that our leader was about. Because if you take a third look, the alternative to trying for peace is really bleak. I mean, it's attack after attack as Hamas emerges, or something like it emerges in Gaza. It's the possibility of the West Bank becoming even more radicalized. And that's terrible for the Palestinians, not only because of the violence that would occur to them, but also because they'd be continued to be governed by corrupt and, frankly, useless governments. But I think it's also very, very bad for Israel. It does nothing for a country when it's occupying another, when it has to dish out daily humiliations, when it gradually loses the support of much of the world. And so that leader was written from the point of view of, when you really think about this hard, it's necessary that there's peace. And then in that spirit, if it's necessary, let's look through at the possibilities. And I think there is a path to peace, however difficult it might seem.
Zanny, can I bring you in here? Possibility of peace, and also, can peace happen with Benjamin Netanyahu in power in Israel?
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, Rachna. I think the answer is no, in a lasting sense. I think Benjamin Netanyahu's days in power are numbered, and as we've written in several editorials, frankly, the sooner the better, because peace of the sort, real peace, and it does seem such a far-flung prospect right now, but in the many conversations I've had with Ed and my other colleagues about this, the reason we wrote the editorial that Ed described 10 days ago is precisely because at this moment where it seems so far away, actually it could be the awfulness of the current situation could be something that helps unlock a proper peace process. And I use that word advisedly because I don't just mean a return to the endless years of a failed Oslo peace process. And there are a couple of things that have really changed now. One is obviously the horror of the past few 2 months. But secondly, I think you have an Arab world that feels differently than it did about what can be if there is peace in this region. And Ed, as you've just heard, has been in Israel. And you and I, Rachna, if you remember, were in the Gulf, indeed on October the 7th, where we had one of the more memorable experiences that either of us have had, I think, when we went to see the deputy political head of Hamas. But we also then spent some time with leaders in that region. And it really seems to me that, not just the Abraham Accords, but the strength of those economies have shown what a peaceful, prosperous future means in that part of the world. And I think there is a sense that with cooperation between the US, obviously, as Israel's most important ally, but also the Arab states, there is a possibility, but it will require, and this is the absolutely central part, I think, and the long-winded answer to your question, it will require different leadership, both in Israel and amongst the Palestinians. And I think that's an absolute sine qua non. It won't happen tomorrow, but I don't think you can see a serious prospect of the kind of peace that Ed has laid out with the current ossified Palestinian leadership, and certainly not with Hamas, and you can't see it with the current Israeli leadership.
You're right, Zanny. We were in the Middle East soon after the attacks, and that's not a week I'm going to forget. That's for sure. You mentioned Hamas. We have a question from a subscriber, Cindy, who notes or asks about Hamas's financial strength and whether that makes it impossible for Israel to eradicate, in quotes. So, is that aim just rhetoric then?
So I think this word eradicate has to be sort of unpacked a bit. I think the Israeli goal is to destroy Hamas as a ruling authority in Gaza, to dramatically weaken its military capability. And we can have a discussion of how well it is doing in that role and at what cost. And the answer is clearly it has not yet gone anywhere near destroying its military capability. The leadership is still intact. There are still many fighters in the tunnels killing Israelis. And it's come, to be clear, at extraordinary cost in terms of the price of Palestinian lives in Gaza. So that sort of narrower goal hasn't yet anywhere near been reached. And I think also the recent tactics cannot continue indefinitely. There is clearly a time limit on how long Israel can carry on doing what it's doing now. But I think without Hamas being dramatically weakened, indeed sort of defeated as a military capability, and removed as a ruling entity in Gaza, I think there cannot be a serious peace process of the sort that we've just been talking about. There has to be different Palestinian leadership. But you're right that Hamas has several sources of strength. One is obviously its physical control in Gaza. It has the reach of its ideas. I think that there has been so far much less radicalization, if you will, from in the rest of the Arab world, but I think that's something that could change. But the most sort of worrying thing is in some ways its financial capability, and it's just really, really sobering that Hamas has an income of around, people estimate, $1 billion a year, of which 750 million come from abroad, and Iran is a very big funder, estimated on the order of 100 million. But the biggest share, some $500 million a year, the broad estimates are, come from Hamas's investments. And there is a web of companies and sort of shadowy financial investments with a lot happening, it is believed, through the Turkish financial system. That is a really powerful ongoing source of funds. So the answer is that, eradicating Hamas as an organization, I think, is a chaotic and unwise goal. I think the narrower goal of this offensive, and Ed, do jump in here, is a military one, which is to dramatically weaken its military capability so that it cannot again do what happened on October the 7th, and to remove it as the controlling power in Gaza.
Ed, once Hamas is removed as the controlling power in Gaza, who then takes over the administration of it? And how does the process of reconstruction work?
Well, I think this is the hardest question of all, because Israel, obviously Israel doesn't want to occupy Gaza, and if it did, it would just bring around more resentment and lead to the next problem. Israel did run Gaza until 2005 and decided it just didn't work. So that's not a solution. So you have to get someone else in. If there's a power vacuum, it seems to me very likely that you get something like Hamas 2.0 emerging again. And the key question goes back to something Zanny was saying a little bit earlier, which is about the willingness of bits of the Arab world to kind of join forces with the United States in order to try and create some sort of breathing space for a moderate Palestinian leadership to emerge. It is a tall order. It'll be very difficult. I'm not sure that countries, the Arab countries, will want to participate, but it is in their interests, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is because what Zanny was talking about, which is their vision of a Middle East, which is much more built on prosperity and commerce than on ideology, particularly on religious ideology. And a number of Gulf countries have shown that that is the way they want to go and have shown that it might work. And the other reason is Iran. If there's a spoiling factor in the Middle East, if there's a country that thrives on chaos and on things falling apart, it's Iran. And Iran is the big enemy of those Gulf countries. And it's fundamentally in their interest to try and ensure that Iran and its proxies, i.e. Hamas and Hezbollah, aren't the ones that profit from a power vacuum. So it is a really difficult problem. I think you have to get the sponsorship of a moderate Palestinian leadership, eventually one that is legitimized by elections in fairly short order, but once you've started reconstruction, you've begun to get some sort of bureaucracy. I think that's the way to do it. And just saying it makes you realize how hard it is, but it is, to my mind, the only way.
And Danny, you were talking about time running out for Israel. So talk to us a little bit more about that. So we had America's President Joe Biden, for instance, saying that Israel was losing international support because of its invasion of Gaza. Do you agree? How quickly is the clock ticking?
I think the clock is ticking, not so much because of the invasion, but because of the way it is being prosecuted. And I think the world is looking at the toll in terms of civilian casualties in Gaza and saying this cannot go on. And I think that you're seeing a huge growing political problem for the Biden administration inside the US. And also there is, I think, a sort of general recognition, even amongst sort of military specialists, that the nature of the way this sort of operation against Hamas needs to continue is more targeted and less blanket, and that you cannot, the Israelis cannot sustain support for this kind of action for months and months and months at the price that they're doing. And so I think that's clearly shifted, and understandably and rightly so. I mean, throughout the recent weeks, we have been arguing strongly for Israel to do more to ensure that there are safe zones for civilians, that there is more aid getting through. And this approach that's been taken thus far, I think, is going to be very hard for them to continue. The difficulty is going to be most for the United States, where this is becoming a very big problem in an election year in the Democratic Party. And I think there will be therefore growing pressure, and you're already hearing words suggesting that it's just a matter of weeks, and American officials are talking about things have got to change by the new year. I think things will have to change. And also, and so this is something that is probably sort of less focused on, the scale of mobilization taking place in Israel is going to affect the Israeli economy in a way that is also not sustainable at this scale ad infinitum.
Talk the audience through how we thought about coverage in those early days.
We learned a lot from the other big conflict that has obviously been focusing a lot of our attention, which is Ukraine, just in terms of the practicalities of how we did it.
There are sometimes advantages in being quite small, because we all talk to each other, we all know each other, and we can get this thing going very, very fast. And I think that gives us something of an advantage over much larger news and more bureaucratic news organizations.
For me, there have been many striking moments in the last couple of months, but one was, if you all remember, there was that moment where the hospital was struck, and most of the world's press quickly followed the idea that this was an IDF attack on the hospital. And I remember very, very vividly this little WhatsApp group I was telling you about, and our excellent colleague Anshel Pfeffer in Jerusalem said, I would be very careful of this within about 5 or 10 minutes. And because there's such a small group, we were able to take stock and say, let's be very cautious about this. And I'm, delighted that we were very cautious about it. But it was one of those things where, as Ed says, being a small group, and we're a tenth the size of the New York Times. We're very, very much smaller than some of the other much larger organizations covering this. We're able to do that in this small group.
Now, nonetheless, even all the more impressive as we're a small group, we couldn't take our eye off the other war that was still sort of raging this year. And Zanny, in fact, you were in Kiev in September. So we've got some covers from our Ukraine coverage over the past year flashed up. Tell us about the mood in Kiev when you were there.
So I went back to Kiev in September, as you said, with Arkady Ostrovsky, our Russia and East Europe editor. It was 18 months, almost exactly, since he and I had first gone there 3 weeks after the invasion. And we went to really get a sense of what it was like, this country, 18 months in. And I spent a week there. And I guess my two big reactions were that Kiev itself felt like a normal city again. I mean, apart from the fact that everyone, including me, downloaded the Air Alert app onto their phone, and you got the Air Alert when there was one, but because the Iron Dome-like, not quite, but the air defenses are really quite strong, no one particularly worried about it then. Right now, 2 months later, there are far, far more, and they're far more potentially impactful, as you will have seen this week. So Kiev felt like a pretty normal city. In fact, buzzing. New restaurants, it was the late summer, really, really buzzing. But the mood amongst all of the government officials, all of the people that we talked to, was, and I think this hadn't really become publicly that clear, although it now is, was the recognition that the counteroffensive hadn't been as successful as had been hoped, and that this was going to be a long war. It was going to take a long time. And as you know, a little later, General Zaluzhny said to us in an interview about a few weeks ago that it had reached a stalemate. But at that point, they weren't using the word stalemate, but the words long war were definitely used. And I came back very sobered that much of the rhetoric then about, when will this offensive succeed and when will the territory be regained, needed recalibrating. And this is really all about ensuring that Ukraine thrives as a westward-facing democracy in the face of what is going to be a very long, protracted conflict with Russia.
Ed, exactly as Zanny said, we ran an interview with Ukraine's commander-in-chief last month, and he said the war, sort of described the war as a stalemate. How do the problems on the battlefield translate into political tensions both within Ukraine, around the world?
Well, I think, Rachna, the battlefield's absolutely central to generating the rest of the narrative. We asked quite recently on a cover, is Putin winning? And the answer is not on the battlefield. In the battlefield, it's a stalemate. As you said, the Ukrainian counteroffensive stalled. And now around the town of Avdiivka, Russia's losing perhaps 1,000 men a day, an incredible number. But this generates the narrative that Ukraine is stuck and that Russia will carry on regardless. So I don't think Putin's winning on the battlefield, but I do worry that he's winning inside the heads of Western policymakers. And here you see in the European Union, you saw just last night that the 50 billion euros of funding has been delayed. Yes. Membership of the EU is now going to begin, but those talks can be dragged out an incredibly long time and can become a major source of frustration unless the Europeans really get a move on. And in Washington, you see the stalling of a huge funding package worth over $60 billion. Now that might go through, as the European one's gone through, but what you sense is that politics has entered this debate. It used to be the case that everyone was behind Ukraine. Now politics is going at it again, and that's ugly and difficult. And so I think, were things to change on the battlefield, that narrative would change fundamentally. And just to finish, one of the things that I think you'll see being debated much more prominently in the next few months is this idea that Ukraine can start to make a real dent in Crimea, not by invading it, but by striking it with long-range missiles, by using various sort of marine drones in order to be able to sink some Russian ships. And if you can make Crimea a dangerous place for Russia, then resupplying Russia's lines get harder. And again, you might start to see a change in the narrative. But always when you think, well, why is people down about Ukraine, or why is Ukraine looking better? You can usually trace this to some change in dynamics on the battlefield.
And that relates to a question that Ian, who's listening in, watching us has submitted through the Q&A. And it's exactly about whether the Ukraine war is now unwinnable for Ukraine. So his view is Russia seems to have more reliable superiority in men, material, and the failure of the counteroffensive means that Russia's territorial gains seem pretty impregnable. I might ask both of you to respond, maybe Ed, if you go first, to Ian.
Yeah, of course. So, Rachna, I don't think this war really is about territory. Ukraine says it wants all its territory back. I think, we have to see whether what I'm about to say is true, but I think ultimately that they'd settle for not having all of it back. What this war is about is whether Ukraine can emerge as a thriving, democratic, westward-leaning country with very strong ties to Europe. I still think that's possible. I think it'll take time. I think it's difficult, but I think it's possible. And whether it's possible depends crucially on attitudes in the West. Believe me, the Ukrainians understand what they're fighting for, and they're willing to continue fighting. The question is, are they given the resources? As for Russia, right now, Putin's feeling a little bit pleased with himself. You saw in his sort of mega press conference just yesterday that he was feeling pretty good. That could all change very quickly. Think back to the summer when suddenly Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group started sort of marching on Moscow, and Putin was clearly rattled. These things can change very, very quickly. So we'll have to see. But I think this is very winnable. Yes.
Zanny?
So I agree with all of that. I would add a couple of things. One is that in 2024, I think you should expect to see a lot of talk about how this is going more Russia's way. Clearly, Putin is waiting for the November US elections. I have no doubt about that. And Russia's economy in the long term is clearly being hurt by this. But in the short term, Rachna, as you know very well from our coverage, is actually holding up remarkably well. And with the oil price where it is, Russia is not going to be sort of forced into being unable to do what it is doing, which is essentially creating a war economy where it is paying people a huge amount of money to go and fight. Putin won't do any kind of forced mobilization, certainly not until after the election, which, although its outcome is a foregone conclusion, he still would like, I'm sure, to be 99% or whatever it is that he's hoping for. 24 will look like it's going Putin's way. But I think Ed is completely right. The definition of victory here is not, I'm afraid, about returning to the 1991 borders. And I'm sure he's right that when it comes to the conversations that will eventually end this, it will be not primarily about territory. I think the real test of whether Ukraine wins is whether Ukraine is a independent, westward-focused, viable economy on its way to the European Union. And the only other thing I'd add to Ed's excellent description of that is it's not just assistance from the West, although that's central. It is the real promise, and that's why I'm actually rather upbeat about what happened last night in Europe, where there was a real promise of membership, that path is followed, and it forces the Ukrainians to do and continue to do the kinds of reforms that they need to do to become a thriving, self-sustaining economy. Because one of the things that struck me when I was there is that actually there are so many ways in which Ukraine becomes an incredible asset to Europe in that scenario, and not least, frankly, with the largest battle-hardened army in Europe, and with what will become quite a capable military-industrial complex. I mean, Ukraine in the future could be the key to really genuine European security, which and this is a different conversation, but on a medium to long-term trajectory, I think Europe has to realize that it has to, even more than it has done, it has to take more of its control for its own security into its own hands. It can't always rely on the United States. And Ukraine, to my money, is a really powerful part of that. And that would be a clear definition of victory for Ukraine.
Thank you, Zanny. We will come back to America's elections, even though they haven't happened yet. Undoubtedly, they loomed over the world. Already, they were looming over the world. But before we do that, let's talk about China a little bit. The year started with something of a low point in the relationship between China and America. We started the year writing about America shooting down a Chinese spy balloon. But Zanny, you were also in China around spring of this year. Talk us through how that relationship has developed over the course of the year.
You're right, Rachna. I seem to go to places just when relations are really absolutely terrible. But I went in March, I was in Beijing, and it was just after Balloon Gate. And there essentially was sort of no contact between the Chinese and the Americans. There had been, at the end of 2022, if you remember, the meeting between Xi Jinping and President Biden in Bali on the fringes of the G20 conference. And there was quite a sort of sense of excitement that actually maybe this relationship might be put on a better footing. Balloon Gate killed all that off. It was terrible when I was there in March. And it not only did I get the sense very powerfully that in Beijing, there was sort of growing and near universal view that the US is out to keep China down, and a real anger at this. I had a similar view when I was in Washington about China, and it really seemed to me, and I remember coming back, I think, Ed, you'll remember this too. I may have even called you from Beijing saying, this is just so depressing. It feels like we're in the middle of, we're sort of, early, just pre-First World War. This seems to be on a path to conflict. It was very, very downbeat. And my sense of what happened through the year is that both sides recognized that. And both sides have recognized that actually total lack of contact, particularly military contact, really leaves the world vulnerable to an accident. And that both sides have realized there are still deep underlying suspicion, hostility, incompatibility of values. This is at very best a deep competition. It's, I think, probably worse than that. But I think in the last 6 months, we've had a sense of they do not want to, sleepwalk into conflict, either side. And so we've seen a kind of improvement in the mood music. We've had a lot of shuttle back channel diplomacy that, of course, then ended up with the meeting between President Biden and President Xi near San Francisco just a few weeks ago. And while I don't think the relationship is at its core any better, I think that the sort of tactics around it and the management of it is better. So I guess this is a long-winded way of saying I think it is slightly less dangerous than it was in March this year.
Ed, I've got a question for you from one of our subscribers, John, who is curious about the kind of domestic dynamics within China. So he's asking, how secure politically is Xi Jinping?
Well, I suppose that the main answer is China is more of a black box politically than it has been in decades. So you really don't know exactly what's going on. But you can see that this year Xi has sacked his foreign minister, Qin Gang, and his defense minister, and the two top commanders of the Rocket Corps. So there's been quite a lot of purging going on. And I guess that suggests that his power is actually strengthening at the moment. The thing about these systems is that they look very secure until they aren't. And the clampdown is really affecting China. It's having an effect on China's society, and it's having an effect on China's economy as well. And so I think the message is that Xi is putting the party's authority and his own authority in the party above pretty much everything else. And that makes him more secure until it doesn't.
Thank you. That's sort of somewhat worrying prognosis. Let's talk a little bit about America. As I say, the presidential election is a big story for next year, but we've still been thinking about it. We've been writing about it. And The World Ahead, our annual look at the coming year, called Mr. Trump the biggest danger to the world in 2024. So, Zanny, a question that I'm sure a lot of our subscribers will be thinking about. How do you rate Mr. Trump's chances of a second term?
Uncomfortably high, I think, is the simple answer to that. Look, you all know that Donald Trump is runaway favorite to be the Republican nominee. And, the United States is a narrowly divided country, and this election is going to be decided by a relatively small number of people in a relatively small number of states. And so if he becomes the Republican nominee, the chances are just uncomfortably high that he becomes the president. And that's, of course, added to by the fact that President Biden's there are many concerns about him, not least his age. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. So, I can put a number on it. If you look at the betting markets, they have him as the favorite. If but it's high. This is a very real possibility. And it's something that I am very struck that certainly outside the US, not enough people are really focusing on what, planning for and thinking about. And I've made it's become a kind of parlor game of mine. I'm asking everyone I come across, whether it's a politician or a policymaker anywhere outside of the US, are you making plans for what happens if Trump wins the election? And I haven't actually had anyone who said, yes, we're making very detailed plans. I think there's just a kind of, oh my God, we can't really deal with this in the rest of the world. And that is going to change in 2020. This is going to be the main topic of conversation for the next 12 months as the world gets to grips with this possibility. Now, at the same time, politics is always full of surprises. And when I look through American political history, we've rarely had a time when, the people who were front runners at this stage have sort of cruised their way to the nomination all the way through. So something could happen, and we can perhaps talk about what that might be, but I just wouldn't bank on it. Right now, this is a very, very serious possibility.
Now, you raised a couple of things. We've got lots of questions coming in from attendees in the live Q&A about Mr. Trump, as you might expect. Peggy asked, and Ed, I might ask you to answer this one. What happens to the current world order if Trump is re-elected?
I think it's not great for the current world order, I'd say. Trump 1's foreign policy actually was, I think, more successful than most people give it credit for. Let's think. I mean, he brought the sense that China was a threat, and as Zanny's been saying, that is a dangerous thing and it can go too far. But the realization that America needed to wake up and deal with China was important. You had the Abraham Accords. I think that you've seen that if there is peace in the Middle East, that would be a key element in that success. He did various things which were kind of less bad. He armed Ukraine, for instance. I think Trump 2 is likely to be different. It's all very good to be transactional, but one of the things that's become clear about Trump in latter days, and look at his reaction to the election in 2020 as an example, is that he's becoming less and less attached to reality. The other thing I think that shows is that he's really not very encumbered by values. And I think transactional without a sense of reality or values means you're in a very dangerous territory. And where I'd look particularly is in Europe. You don't have to leave NATO for the essential promise that binds NATO together, which is a commitment to come to each other's aid, for that to begin to weaken. And if it begins to weaken, and let's say Ukraine is abandoned by the United States under Trump, and don't forget he said he'll solve that conflict in 24 hours. If that starts to happen, then the whole NATO alliance could start to look shaky, and Putin could decide to test it. If you look at his economic policy, he's talked about a 10% global tariff, which would cause immense damage to the world and cause incredible bad feeling. And with Taiwan, I don't know whether Asian allies of the US would feel really secure, especially if Europe starts to go in the wrong direction. So does that mean that you'd start to see Japan and South Korea feel they have to bolster their defenses? And would that mean that they might talk about going nuclear and acquiring a bomb? Those things sound so far-fetched when you say them, but they are actually all possible. So I think the global order heads in quite a rocky direction, I'm afraid.
Well, we'll come back to more questions about America's election once we've gone through a few more of the big themes of the year. And the next one is the world economy. Now, this time last year, we were worried about recession. And actually, one of the big surprises of 2023 was how successfully that's been avoided and how resilient the world economy has been. So, Zanny, why is that? Why has the global economy been so resilient?
Well, I think there are several answers, but I'll point to two. The first is that actually, central bankers, particularly the Fed, having, in my view, allowed inflation to get much too high, did a better job of managing a soft landing than we anticipated. And so the impact of higher interest rates, which we assumed would, or we expected based on historical precedents, to have a much bigger hit on the economy than they did, was sort of weaker. So, hats off to them. They've thus far, handled that pretty well. Although I have to say, it seems like a slightly premature pivot to the loosening rhetoric that we've heard from the US. The second is that fiscal policy has been remarkably loose. And this is something that I think is worth reminding our US viewers about. The US budget deficit is on the order of, and correct me if I've got it not precisely right, Rachna, 7% of GDP. We are not in a recession. We are at peacetime. That is unprecedented. It's an extraordinary scale of deficit. And so we've had not just the enormous deficit spending that came during the pandemic, which frankly was one of the underlying causes of the high inflation to start with. We now still have this enormous fiscal support. And so that has underpinned the economy to a remarkable degree. So I think those two things together go quite a long way to explain what's gone on. And then if the US economy is resilient, everything else is buoyed by that. And the one area that and we may come to it, the one economy that's really underperformed very dramatically is China. And China, one of the concerns was if China roars back from its COVID shutdown, that it would, raise commodity prices and prove a negative price shock on the rest of the world economy, and that hasn't happened.
Yes, and Ed, I wanted to ask you about China. In fact, the cover that we did on China's economy in the summer was our most read cover leader of the year. So many of our subscribers were really sort of interested and wanted to know what was going wrong. Exactly as Annie said, the hopes were high at the start of the year that reopening would mean a bit of a boom. In fact, things disappointed. So what went wrong?
I suppose there were a number of headwinds against China anyway. I mean, demography is one. This was the year when the Chinese population was overtaken by India. Therefore, China's having to, got fewer people coming into the labour market, having to put more resources towards caring for them. I think the returns to all of the infrastructure investment that have been going on have started to lower. There's high rates of debt and, in particular, problems in the property sector that we've been seeing all year. So there are all those things. But what, to me, made the real difference here, and the thing that cover picked out, was that there's also been just a pattern of policy failures. The most obvious one is the emergence from the COVID lockdowns. It was very obvious that China was going to have to emerge. It was very obvious that doing so would lead to a wave of infections because, remember, total infections in China have been really, really low. Amazingly, they'd managed to keep those right down, which meant the population was very vulnerable to the virus when you allowed people to circulate. And yet the government was unable to prepare for this. And in the end, the very infectious Omicron variant came along at the beginning of the year and basically forced China to open up. So that was a policy failure, totally avoidable. But also, Zanny earlier was talking on about how expansionary US policy is at the moment, both fiscally and in terms of the way the central bank managed a very easy slowdown. Well, China's been the opposite. Xi Jinping's talked out against welfareism. He's very disinclined to allow expansion in the property sector. He's trying to clear that out. And so there's a sort of sense that everything has to be subordinated to the party. And the last element, I think, is that the geopolitical tensions have meant that all sorts of problems have been occurring in trade, partly imposed by the United States, but also some of China's own doing. I mean, expatriate executives and their representatives and the people who look after them have found themselves really quite badly treated by the government in China. So bad policy has made a difficult situation worse. And I think it really starts to undermine people's expectations for the economy. So you saw that earlier cover that you put up of China going flat rather than growing. Expectations about exactly when Chinese growth peaks and where it goes from there, I think, have changed this year.
Now, another big theme of the year has been AI, generative AI. And I want to mention our word of the year. No review of 2023 would be complete without the mention of ChatGPT, which was our word of the year. And it's a term that's quickly become a generic way to refer to generative artificial intelligence. Zanny, how have your thoughts on AI evolved over the course of the year? And have you come to any conclusions about how easy access to AI might affect the way we as journalists do our jobs?
Well, I think you can, if I asked you this question, you'd probably say that I've gone from driving you all nuts about AI because I talk about little else. I would, first of all, I think you and your colleagues have done fantastic work on AI. We've done some really extraordinarily good journalism explaining exactly what this amazing new technology could lead to, which I commend to you. And I think we have a whole, on our website and on our app, there's a whole hub of AI stories, and they're really worth looking at. I have always been, as the two of you know, more excited than terrified by this technology. And I am now of the view at the end of this, so a year, I guess, just over a year since ChatGPT arrived in all of our lives, I think it is going to make a tremendous difference over the medium term. Like most of these technologies, it will take longer to be sort of introduced into our lives. There was a huge, crash bang when ChatGPT arrived. Hundreds of millions of people used it. then I think everyone sort of worked out how to, have it write the best possible speech for them, or, all the easy things. Most people then say, great, tried that, and don't go any further. It takes longer for these technologies to diffuse. However, the pace of improvement is just remarkable. And I think we're all going to be blown away in 2024 by the capabilities of the next generation. They are increasing by orders of magnitude, not just, it's just going to be remarkable. And in terms of how it changes journalism, there'll be a lot of hand-wringing about the future of journalism. There's already big changes, as you will have seen. Some media companies are signing up with, Microsoft ChatGPT for their content. There's going to be a lot of debate about who owns content. I'm actually for us, for The Economist. I think there's tremendous possibility, and the two of you know I keep going on about this, but I do. I think it offers us enormous opportunity in the near term in areas like translation, in capabilities of improving our productivity tremendously. I'm very clear that whatever you read, watch, listen, The Economist will be produced by a human unless we very clearly say otherwise, and we have no intention of using generative AI to create our journalism, but it is helpful in research. It's going to make data journalism much easier. And then I think in a sort of medium-term context, there are tremendous and exciting possibilities about what can be done. But we can leave that perhaps for next year's discussion, because they're still all early days, but we have lots of AI groups. We're about to start an AI boot camp. There's a lot of stuff going on at The Economist, and I probably think my colleagues think I've, please stop talking about AI and forcing us to do more of this. But you tell me, Rachna.
Well, no, I think I'm in the same camp as you. I think it's exciting rather than terrifying, and it opens up lots of possibilities, I think. So we'll be talking. Oh, go on, Ed.
Well, I was going to say I want to add a slightly different note, because one of the high points for me this year was when Zanny and I went to spend 2 days with Henry Kissinger in one of his last really long interviews, and spent 8 hours with him as he talked about. Well, he talked about the future, really. Amazingly, he told us he was still working on his last 2 books, which sadly now will never be written, I'm afraid. But he is particularly exercised about AI, and his life's work, I think, was a search for stability in international relations. And he worried that AI would change the battlefield and the nature of the rivalry between great powers to such an extent that it would create instability in the relationship between China and America. And I remember, Zanny, don't you? He had that chilling thought that they had, I think it was 5 years to sort out how to run their relationship and deal with AI. So, I hope everything's going to be fine, but there's a niggling doubt in my mind as to whether it might be worse.
I think you're right. And lest any of you watching think I'm a complete Pollyanna on this, there are clear risks. And our conversation with Henry Kissinger made them clear, but there are many conversations going on in many governments right now. And I don't downplay those at all. However, I think what is striking is how much discussion and indeed how much action there has been in the last year in terms of thinking about regulating AI, thinking about the safety of these models, which if you compare it to previous technologies is happening at a much earlier level in the life cycle of the technology. Now, so it should, because this is potentially so powerful. But I am, I guess, relatively optimistic, because I think there has been a seriousness of purpose about discussing how to limit the risks, how to gain the most from these technologies, how to try and do it safely. Now, there will be accidents. I've always said there will be things that go wrong. There will be people who get powerful AIs who will do things that are harmful. But I'm hoping they will be, harmful in a way that is not too dramatic. And we had that, at a much smaller level with the introduction of the automobile. We had decades of huge numbers of road accidents before auto safety was brought in. And so this time around, there is a lot of discussion about safety very early on. And for me, that is one of the reasons to be optimistic. And at the same time, it's really becoming clear how much potential this technology has in areas like scientific discovery, in healthcare. Really dramatic changes can come from it. So on balance, I'm more optimistic than pessimistic, but definitely not Pollyanna-ish. And you're right, Ed. If on the battlefield, it's already changing, right? On the battlefield, you are already seeing the use of AI very dramatically in Ukraine. It's the future of war, as our colleague Shashak Joshi, who you will know from previous webinars, has written very compellingly, is already quite different.
Now, the questions from the audience are rolling in, so let's turn to them. Now, just before we do that, a quick plug for the world ahead. I'll look into what to expect from next year. It covers everything from the elections of 2024 to the Great North American Eclipse, and the QR code that's on screen now should take you straight there. Now, to those audience questions. One from Ed, which is a very interesting one, is what story was at the time a seemingly big one that when looking back seems overblown?
Now, that's always a very difficult question because you've forgotten about it almost by definition because it's been eclipsed by something else. Help me out, Zanny. What was a big story that wasn't one? I mean, people obsess about various things. We obsessed about a submarine.
The consequences of the bank failures. Silicon Valley Bank. There was a very real thought that we were at the beginning of another bank crisis, a major bank crisis, and it didn't happen. And for me, that it's sort of tied up with the doom and gloom about the US economy. I mean, it really is worth remembering that had we had this conversation a year ago, we would have been saying, with great confidence that it was very likely to be a recession next year and the US economy was really heading for we were all completely wrong. And I think that part of the way in which we viewed Silicon Valley Bank's demise, and Rachna, you and your team did fantastic work on that, but I think you all thought, and I thought, it was the beginning of another major series of bank crises, and it ain't happened.
I guess there's Turkey. We thought that Turkey would have a change of government and that 10, 15 years of Erdogan would be over. Didn't happen. He's just sailed back into power. I think we get things wrong. So there are things like that really look they're building up to something and they don't happen. Tell you what though, there's so much going on that it just blots everything else out.
Sort of as you were talking about recessions, Annie, I was wondering if, this time next year we'll be looking back and going, oh, that recession finally arrived, or whether actually it's averted. That's the big question that I think we'll be grappling with over the months to come. A question from Jerry, which relates to our cover package of this week. Do you think the public will start paying more attention to mainstream news sources in coming years, or just keep narrow sourcing? Ed?
I think the narrow sourcing trend is here, actually. I find that there are particular writers and particular voices that I pay attention to. And sometimes, as for instance, there's one of the columnists in the Times in London lost his job, David Aronovich, who's particularly good. I now have to go and read him on Substack. And that just wouldn't have happened before. I think that trend's going to continue. And there are, as we explained in our leader this week, that comes with certain problems because you get a fragmentation of the audience and you find that people don't have a common set of facts and a common set of views.
Zanny?
I do worry about it continuing, and I've worried about this for a while, which is one of the reasons we wrote this week's cover story. I think in the United States in particular, the narrowcasting of the media landscape and the loss of trust in the mainstream media is a really serious problem. And it's, in Europe, we have smaller countries, and by and large, the fact base is anchored by public broadcasters. Whether everyone in the UK loves to hate the BBC, but in the end, the BBC is a sort of unifying source of facts. And my concern about the US, and this is something I may have said on these webinars before, whenever I go to the US, I force myself to watch 10 minutes of cable news in the morning and in the evening. And if I watch MSNBC, the left-leaning one in the morning, I'll watch Fox in the evening, or vice versa. It's not something I recommend. It's not terribly edifying, but it is a very powerful reminder that not only is the US a country where people have differing opinions. They really do. You could be in a different country watching those two different sources of cable news. And I think where you cannot have honest debate around a common set of facts, I think that's really, really alarming. And I think it's partly because of, what has been a long-standing shift in the conservative media world towards, at least in some instances, mendacity, really, really dangerous shifts. But it is also, and this is what our package this week was about, the sort of illiberalism of some mainstream media and the leftward bias of it. And we've got some, I think, really interesting data analysis that the data team did, really showing that that's happened. And so the result is that there are just two different ecosystems in the US, and that is what the sort of narrow casting, which was the phrase we used in our editorial, was about. And I think it's a real problem. I think it's not clear to me how you sustain a healthy democracy in that environment. And it's not just, it's too simple to say it's because of social media. It's more, it preceded that. It's now a different form with the rise of TikTok. But I think the narrowcast, fragmented landscape where you have a democracy with people living in different informational universes is really quite worrying.
One question from David, still based in America, is what has to happen for Trump not to be the next American president? And a related, not a small question, is American democracy broken? Zanny, I might ask you to answer that somewhat weighty, very weighty question.
So I'll take the first bit first. There are lots of things that could happen that would result in Donald Trump not being president. One is he could win the nomination, which does seem very likely, and then lose the general election. I think that is still perfectly possible. I think the question of whether he would lose against President Biden or if there was a different nominee, it is possible that he would lose against President Biden, regardless of what the polls say now. It is possible that during an election campaign, when you are almost certainly going to have sort of split screens between a trial and a campaign rally, will be a sort of sobering experience. There are also, and I say this with some caution, we are talking about two, men who are not young, and one of whom at least does not have a terribly healthy lifestyle. So there are all manners of things that could happen. I think those would be my two main ones. I suspect that if you had a different Democratic nominee, things would look very different. Ed, what do you think?
I think the campaign itself is just very unpredictable. But I think the chances of, say, Nikki Haley winning in New Hampshire and South Carolina, which is what would be required, I think, for him not to be the nominee, are pretty slim, especially because DeSantis's voters tend to flip back to Trump, as our tracker shows. So I think the chances are extremely high. If he's president, what about democracy? Well, you can so easily think yourself into a kind of panic about this, because at every stage of Trump's rise, the cost for someone within the Republican Party to stand up and say this man should not be near power, as the risk of him being in power has risen, the cost has risen faster, and those who have stood up have not really survived. And so you can sort of play this out with him as a candidate and then him in power, especially if he, as he says he wants to, if he takes control of the bureaucracy by making it possible to sack federal employees much more easily than you can at the moment, then you could see Trump getting hold of various institutions. But I do have, it's a faith rather than a sort of sense of empirical judgment. It's a faith in the institutions of the United States, the courts, the army, the good sense of its citizens, and the fact that citizens on both sides believe they're defending the republic. They don't, you haven't got many Americans who outright want to lose their democracy. All of those on both sides feel that they're defending the democracy. Those factors mean that I think there's a very long way to go between the election of Trump and the collapse of American democracy. But I think people need to talk about it. The thing is that when you start to think in these terms, it can, the narrative can run away with you so fast that you can fall into some sort of terrible slough of despond And that's not a very good way to go about actually constructing a positive case for why Trump needs to be defeated. And I think there is a positive face. America could be much better with a different candidate and a different agenda.
Thank you both. Now, just before I let you go, I've got one last question for you. I would like to invite both of you to make a prediction for 2024. It can be as big or as small as you like, but what might we be discussing this time next year? Zanny, what's yours?
Well, you've previewed my one. I was going to say that I suspect, just as this year we've ended up being surprised by how strong the economy is and how the recession didn't happen. We haven't given up on the business cycle. It is going to come, and at some point the economy is going to slow. So that would be my one. And I really hope that we have this conversation in a year's time and we do not have the sort of litany of potential disasters that we've been talking about, that we can be upbeat about where the world is heading. And I think it's worth remembering, we haven't mentioned it in this conversation, but the US is by far the most important, but it is one of, I think, 75 elections next year. For the first time in history, more than half the world's population lives in countries that are having elections. 4.1 billion people live in those countries. I think 2.7 billion people are eligible to vote. So depending on voter turnout, there probably could be a couple of billion people voting. India, South Africa, Indonesia, Mexico, you name it, there are going to be elections there. And not last but not least, quite possibly this country, which you may not all care about that much, but is the good news is that whoever wins, it's not going to be a catastrophe in the UK. And so there's going to be a lot of elections, a lot of changed faces. And my prediction is that we'll probably be more worried about the economy. And my hope is that we won't be as worried about the politics as we could be.
Thank you, Zanny. So perhaps recession, not catastrophe. I've written this all down. We'll talk about it next year. Ed, what's your prediction?
Well, one of the things that's worried me this year is the way in which the global south has been drifting away from the West. And it started with Ukraine, a sense that the call to support Ukraine by the United States and the West because of what Putin was doing, that call was somehow based in hypocrisy. And that, when commodity prices were going up, it was the poor countries that were yet again paying the price. That has worsened a lot this year, particularly over the war in the Middle East and Gaza, where Russia has successfully, and with some basis, actually been sort of portraying the West as hypocritical and as if it only really cares about some people but not other people. That is, to my mind, is a really corrosive element of the way the world is run, and it makes everything much harder. My prediction, it is based on hope more than anything, but my prediction is that will go into reverse next year, that it'll start in the Middle East, and that I hope it starts to change elsewhere as well, and that there can be a sense that there are real platforms on which countries can get together to start to solve some of the world's problems.
It's nice to end on a hopeful note. I hope that we are back here this time next year talking through a more cheerful 2024. And that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much to Zanny and Ed for a fantastic discussion. This is the last subscriber event of 2023. We hope you've enjoyed our sessions this year, and we'll be back in January. But in the meantime, thanks for watching and hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to find out more about our subscriber events, please click the link. There you can also find recordings of our previous events, including a look at the world ahead in 2024. See you next time.